Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the podcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Calves are one of our most important resources as they set the trajectory for our entire herd and represent our future productivity and profitability. Getting them to the milking stream can be expensive, but the investment made in growing them correctly, getting them to maturity on time will pay off in the end. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, your host here at the Real Science Exchange. Every operation is looking for ways to be most efficient. Sometimes cutting back around the young stock is considered as an option. Tonight, we'll take a look at this topic and show how appropriate investment in your young stock will pay off big in later years. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gavin Staley, veterinarian and technical service specialist with Diamond V. I'd like to welcome you to the Real Science Exchange, Gavin. Good to see you here tonight.
Thank you, Scott.
In keeping with tradition at the exchange, what's in your glass tonight, and is there a story behind how you chose that?
Oh, absolutely, Scott. So this is Amarula cream liqueur, which comes from my home continent. It is made from the berries of the marula plant, which is a wild-growing tree. And in fact, the animals know about it. And when these fruit get fermented, they are known to get quite tipsy. There are YouTube videos out there of elephants tottering around after consuming marula fruit. So it is a very distinct taste, and I thought it very appropriate for my South African heritage today.
Yeah, very nice. I was going to ask you to kind of touch on that, the continent you're from, and then how did you find your way into dairy science?
So South African, raised and born and educated, I guess. Graduated back in '84 as a veterinarian. So it's amazing how quickly the years go by. Had various experiences. We all went to the military back then. So I spent 2 years running around the kingdom of Zululand in brown fatigues. And then I went back to university and studied for a master's degree while being on staff as a senior lecturer in reproduction. And then I joined a large dairy practice back in my hometown for several years, about 6 years. And then for various reasons, the opportunities in South Africa seem to be somewhat written on the wall. And my wife and I left back 22 years ago, joined a practice in Wisconsin. I had 4 winters, and that was enough. And was offered a position with Monsanto Tech Service in California back then, and stepped off the plane and said, this feels a lot like home, and never left. So I've been in the Central Valley now for 18 years odd, right in proximity to, as you know, a lot of cows. And it's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah,
great
absolutely.
learning.
Yeah, great to hear that. I see you brought a guest with you tonight. Would you mind introducing him?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Al, very gracious of you to come on. Thank you so much for being part of this. Al has a great deal of experience in this field, a lot of practical experience with calves and heifers, knows way more than I do about these the practicalities of it. And so I'm very honored that he's part of this today. So thank you, Al.
Yeah.
Well, you're welcome, Gavin. I appreciated your presentation, and I'd like to talk more about it as we get into this program.
Yeah, great. Al, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then in keeping with the theme, what's in your glass tonight?
Okay. I like beer, a lot of the craft beers. This time of the year until Easter, I do the non-alcoholic beer, and this is a German one. It's Klausthaler, and it has, I think, the best real beer taste without the alcohol. So that's how I selected it.
Very nice.
I grew up about an hour south here in a small dairy farm. Went to the University of Missouri, and then I did a bachelor's, master's there in dairy science. At that time, it's called dairy husbandry. Then I had 2 years in the Army obligation, like Gavin. I had spent 1 year in the Natick laboratories in the Boston area, and second year in food supply in Thailand during the Vietnam War. Then I did a PhD at Cornell University, and that turned out to be a significant project we were involved in because it was in growth and development of cattle. And that's really the base for so much of my interest in growing calves and heifers, and also the metabolic changes that occur in body composition of cows. I went to work for the Purina companies, and that lasted until year 2000, and I went to work for what had been the international company. That only lasted a year and a half until we were bought and kind of closed out. So I started doing my own consulting business, a lot of writing and speaking and on-farm consulting. A lot of that international. I said really there's no difference in the cows in other countries. It's the people and the economic and social situation that differs. And then that resulted in my putting together a book that I published, it'll be 2 years ago. No, yeah, it'll be 3 years ago this summer. It's available if you Google me on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And so it's a good reference for me because it's a compilation of a lot of the columns I've written in Feedstuffs over about 20 years. People kept bugging me about writing a book, and I said, I'm thinking of an academic book, and I thought, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that, and it's too much work and so on. And finally, I realized I've written it in pieces, and I just need to piece it together in a better format. And so I use it a lot for reference myself, easier than going through my computer and digging out the files.
Oh, very nice. We'll have to put the link to that in our show notes. You had mentioned that you'd gone to Cornell. Were you there when Dr. Van Soest was there?
I definitely was. I can contribute some good stories about him. He was a remarkable man. As many of you know, he just died last year. He was very self-effacing, very humble man, very bright, almost eccentric, and he would talk to anybody about anything, and he knew a lot about anything. And in a laboratory, though, he was like an elephant. He was kind of dangerous. And one day, one of the classic stories is there were about a half a dozen of us taking his laboratory analysis course, NDF and ADF, and he was starting from scratch, showing how you make the detergents, the neutral detergent, the acid detergent. So he had a box of the sodium lauryl sulfate detergent, and it's very hydrostatic. So he opened the cardboard box and he opened the plastic lining, and he's digging in there, and then he turns around, and when he turns around, we all broke out laughing because he looked like Santa Claus. The stuff had stuck to his beard. And at first he looked kind of aghast, like, what's wrong? And then he realized what it was, and then he laughed as much as anybody. That was the thing about him. He was so self-effacing. He was a very humble man, very bright, would talk to anybody, and just gained a lot from my experience working with him there.
Yeah, we recorded a podcast, in honor of him a few weeks ago. We had Mike Van Amberg, Mary Beth Hall, and
Dave Mertens.
Dave Mertens, and boy, was that enjoyable. I think we could probably do a series of podcasts. With how many stories are out there on him. Right. So anyway, I wanted to bring that up. So thank you about that. On that. Tonight, co-host Dr. Glenn Ains once again. Glenn's the technical service manager here for Balchem. Glenn, you've been at the pub a lot lately. Should we be concerned?
No. But I enjoy being here, so you can invite me back anytime, Scott.
You're a great co-host, so you're welcome anytime. Glenn, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, I'm actually drinking a product, beer. As you well know, I'm quite fond of beer.
Yeah.
And I've kind of become an IPA guy. And this is called High Five IPA. It's manufactured and brewed just right across the river in Fort Myers, Florida. And it's a good one. So it's nice to have it. It's easy access.
Yeah, good. It's good to have a co-host without a cider once in a while. So that's good.
Yeah, I don't do the ciders, Scott.
Don't do the ciders. All right.
Tonight's pubcast stories are brought to you by Reassure Precision Release Choline. Reassure is the most researched encapsulated choline on the market today, consistently delivering results to your transition cows of higher peak milk, reduced metabolic disorders, and even in utero benefits to her calf, leading to growth and health improvements. Visit balchem.com to learn more.
Gavin, to get us started tonight, you were part of the Real Science Lecture series, and you started us off here in 2022. In your presentation, you mentioned that heifers set the production ceiling for the entire herd. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly, Scott. So one thing I do a lot of is look at records. I'm not a statistician, really. I'm more of a practitioner, and so I stay fairly close to the dairies. But over the years, you can imagine being in the Central Valley Ag software, it became the language. You really have to understand it pretty well if you stay here. And so I accumulated a lot of backups. And the background to this particular story was I was sitting in a dairyman's office in January 2016 looking at records in a management meeting, and it came up, the discussion with the nutrition. Oh, the Posylac's not working. I feed these two dairies, they get 92 pounds, and the one's on Posylac and the other one isn't. And anyway, long story short, I went through the records back and forth, and the only thing I could figure out was that this dairyman who was on Posylac was breeding his heifers about 6 weeks earlier than the other dairy. And that got me really thinking, because by golly, Posylac's not cheap. And if it's just a case of raising heifers for another 6 weeks, that's a big deal. And as we'll probably go into that some more, but that led to this whole uncovering, in a way, of what had gone on in the heifer world out here. But while I was looking at these records, I noticed that the one dairy that had, well, I'll call it more mature heifers, there were two dairies that I compared initially. It was a 92-pound herd, and guess what? The heifers were 92 pounds at about 10 to 14 weeks. And I guess one's trained as a veterinarian to be observant. And I looked at that and I thought, man, is that coincidental or what? And I started digging into more and more herds. Eventually I had several hundred that I looked at. And there was a remarkable correlation between 10-week milk and the average annual herd of the whole dairy. So I'll just say that again, 10-week milk, 10, 12, somewhere there is, and I did a rough correlation with about 150 herds. It was 92% correlation. So if you think about that for a second, and flip it around, if you want to be a 100-pound herd, you have to have 100-pound heifers at 10 weeks. So any way you look at it, you can't outrun these heifers. If they set the bar at 75 pounds is what you'll be. You can't cull your way there. You can't repro your way there. You can't feed your way there. They are the ceiling, and I'm absolutely 100% convinced of that. That is true, and therefore it is absolutely critical that we do a slam dunk job of getting them to where we want them to be. So Scott, that's the sort of the background. Started in a dairyman's office and led to one of several observations, but that was I think the most important one.
It leads kind of to a two-part question I've got in mind. First is, during your investigation, where did you find that most of the dairymen were in terms of freshing their heifers during the most, I guess 24 months looked like from your presentation where most of them should be. And where were most dairymen? And then two, how much have you been able to move the needle in the time that you've been sharing this story?
Yeah, Scott, thinking back to 1982, whenever I did animal husbandry back at the University of Pretoria, I still remember to this day they drummed it into us. 24 months. That's when these animals needed to calve, So what's that? Nearly 40 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. It was 24 months. And anyway, and to a large extent, that was probably what was going on just almost by accident, I guess. Guys were raising their heifers and breeding them at 14 months to get them in somewhere around 2 years. And then, of course, hard times come. And then the spotlight is focused on areas to save. And as you mentioned earlier, heifers often come under that, right? Seeing as that they are such an expensive part of the operation, obviously there is some reason to do that. The problem is, and I use this, it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of course. I say two emails went out, right? The first email said, hey, good news, you can breed heifers earlier, maybe 22 months instead of 24, to bring them in at that. But the second email said you can't do things the same way you used to. And that one, as I jokes, I say, went straight to spam. So a lot of dairymen got the message, oh, breed earlier, a year or 11 months. And there's this kind of catch-up feeling, oh, well, they'll compensate. It'll all be good. It'll wash out. Well, the truth of the matter is it never does wash out. It casts a very long shadow. And so what I had seen was guys creeping down to, 21, 22 months, but the average daily gains were not in sync at all. They were 6 weeks to 2 months out. And so you had this disparity, this disconnect, if you like, between management and biology. And that caused the tension, which I saw in the records. Now, to your second part of your question, I've had a great deal of fun with this particular topic, and more so than I thought I would, because when a dairyman sees the records, his records, on his computer, the production graphs by age at freshening, and sees that rainbow display of lost milk for not just lactation 1, but lactation 2. I've had dairymen pick up the phone in the office and call their breeders and say, as of today, you are breeding at this stage, because it's incredibly powerful when you can couple that to this first statement, which is 10-week milk is your final milk. And then you show the difference in by age freshening. So that has resulted in a number of dairies, and it's actually been a very pleasant outcome seeing dairies now 6 years later, 5 years later, that have done this and pushed back, more towards the 23 months, and then watch the milk production going up. Mature heifers are just the secret to a lot of good things on the dairy.
So most of those dairies, are they just pushing back the breeding date, or are they going all the way back to calving and early nutrition to try and get those calves up to that physiological maturity faster?
Yeah, Glenn, so there's two options. There are only two options. And that's why I'm very glad that Al's in on this too, because he has a great deal of experience with the early calves and so forth. Here's the deal. You either up the ADG or you delay breeding. Those are the only two options. And frankly, in many setups where you've got, heifer raising facilities where there's a number of different philosophies possibly represented, it's a per diem situation. It's easier to delay the breeding at the ADG that it is and achieve maturity that way. It's to get the ADG up to where it needs to be to bring an animal at 21 months is quite a task. I mean, we're talking over 2 pounds and no wobbles and good lung scores. But it does go right back to day one. And I'll say this too. I think we've had the wrong approach with heifers to a large extent, somewhat of survival of the fittest. They like the old far off cows, people just kind of almost forgot about them. And then suddenly we realized they were important. Well, heifers, it turns out, are super important. And we need to be paying attention from day one, and not just till they're out of the hutches and into the run pens, and then forgotten and fed whatever. we need to be monitoring this process right through. If the product is going to be acceptable at the end.
It seems to me like there might be a bit of a difference between like weight and maturity. They're obviously related, but there's differences, right? I mean, weight can be body condition. And so maybe I'd like to ask Al, Al, where do you find the balance? What are you seeing around that?
Well, I would like to go and kind of establish a framework here. We're starting with a calf. When a Holstein calf is born, a heifer calf, it's going to be about 90 pounds. And the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association says the gold standard is double the calf's body weight at the end of 2 months. So you go from 90 to 180. And then if you do the arithmetic that you want a 24-month-old heifer, it says you need to average about 1.8 pound gain after that. Now, a lot of people understand that, but what they don't understand and don't measure is height. And the height is the best indicator of the frame that weight is going to be deposited on. And the height I found was quite different, and I published this in the late 90s in the Journal of Dairy Science. So if a 90-pound calf is 30 inches high at the withers, as a first calf heifer, it'll be about 24 inches higher in 2 years. Now, that's not linear, though, during that 2-year period. Half of that occurs in the first 6 months, and that's what's staggering. And then only 25% in the next 6 months, and then only 25% in the last year before they have the first calf. So if you don't make the height increase when it's biologically controlled, typically by growth hormone, you can't make it up later. And then to Gavin's point, if you're looking only at daily gain and you don't have the height develop to the genetic potential, it doesn't mean we should get taller heifers. That's not the story at all. If you don't have the height and you put on the weight, you're going to start fattening them. And there are studies in beef and dairy that show that when you get up to about a kilo of daily gain, so that's about 2.2 pounds, that's the maximum amount of protein deposition. So if you push that higher, it's all going to be fat. And we know that when you have fat heifers or fat cows, they have calving difficulties because the birth canal is where the fat is internally deposited. And once you have a calving difficulty, you have a compromised calf and cow, or was first calf or later. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. And then to that, the problem is, as Gavin has pointed out, is most operations don't measure their calves and heifers. They don't know how tall they are at various points, and may not even know their weight, but most likely not their height. And it's easier often if you're going to do height to measure hip height instead of wither height. Well, you can take a wither height curve and add 2 inches to it, and that's hip height. So if you want to do hip heights, that's fine. You just add 2 inches to that. Now, there are going to be genetic differences depending on the herd and all that sort of thing. And that's why you'll have some variation in the average age of first calving. So if you have an average of 24 months, and that's what we had when I was with Purina, you'd find some down to 20 months and some up to 26. But to make either one of those a pattern is a problem, because it's like the biology and the chronology works best for 24 months. So that's why I was really interested in Gavin's work, because he's got field data that shows what happens if you push that further down. Now, okay, you push it further down because if it costs you $30 more a month to raise a heifer, you want to save that. But in the process of saving that, you lose milk or you create body condition problems, then you're worse off than you were not doing that. So that's kind of the framework I often think about when I look at these situations. And so I remember one time being on a operation in Southeast on a pasture. And he said, well, what do you think of our heifers? And they look pretty good heifers. And I said, before I can tell you what I think of them, tell me how old they are. Well, they were about 3 months older than they should have been. And so they looked good for that, but they weren't. And then another problem is that if you don't get the calves off to a good start, they don't do as well. And that's been shown by some of Mike Van Amberg's work, that the rate of gain in the first 2 months directly relates to milk production in the first, second, and third lactation. And one of the problems is that we don't do a good enough job weaning calves. I call that a transition period, 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after weaning. If you don't get adequate starter intake, and preferably a texturized, because you get better rumen development, adequate starter intake, when you wean them, that's too big a change, and they struggle for at least 2 weeks and sometimes a month. And this is shown by the most recent NOMS data from 2018. That it was published in the Journal of Dairy Science, but I had to pull the data out. They were there, but they didn't recognize it. And the average daily gain before weaning was 1.6 pounds. Now that's good, because that'll double your body weight in 2 months. But after weaning, it was 1.3 pounds. So it went backwards.
Yep.
And that's because there's too big a change. There's just too many changes and often that sort of thing. And the other factor is that when calves at that age have that much of a change, they get really stressed. Their immunity drops, and they're more likely to have a respiratory problem. Now, maybe the incidence of respiratory problem isn't that great that you see it as a clinical case, but there's some field data from Cornell that showed in the 90s that when a calf had a respiratory problem based on the farm's records, not based on a clinical diagnosis of pneumonia, when they tracked that calf all the way through the herd, they found they were 6 months older when they had the first calf. They were culled sooner, and so you should have gotten rid of them early on. But they don't notice it because they don't follow their records. I had that shown clear to me one time in China when I was on a dairy farm that was being served by a U.S. veterinarian. And he had DairyCom 305 records, and I told him about this. So he pulled up his herd, or his heifers, and he had the age, and he had the weight. And you drew a straight line and went through most of the population, but here were some of these points on the lower end. And every one he clicked on had a respiratory problem. So it's there. We just don't often think of it because we feel like, oh, we treated that calf and it recovered. But it's damaged, and we just haven't monitored enough to notice that. And so when it gets into lactation and doesn't perform well, it gets culled. Well, then you've cost yourself a lot of money, and you cost yourself some time and facilities and all that sort of thing.
You mentioned getting them started off right. Well, getting them started off right doesn't just start at birth, right? I mean, one of the things that we're interested in at Balchem is transgenerational nutrition, right?
Yes.
So it starts not just with the mother, perhaps, even the mother's mother, in terms of the nutrition that they got, is going to have a bearing on how well that animal performs once they're born and then into the milking string. I find that fascinating. Do you guys have any experience or comments on that?
Well, I've seen your data and the research trials from Florida. They're showing the same thing with heat stress, that those calves aren't as large. They don't complete their gestation, and so they struggle, and then their next generation struggles as well. So now you have data from a nutritional standpoint and from a developmental standpoint that both show the same thing. What you're saying is their in utero development is very critical.
Yeah, just to add to that, out here, winter is also a terrible time for us. And you'd think it's the heat stress, but when you look at the ADGs, winter is by far the worst time. And the problem is, so let's take a heat stressed herd. Well, when do most cows calve in a heat stressed herd? It's in the summer. So now we've got transgenerational heat stress in a lot more animals. I mean, talk about setting yourself up for failure, right? This is just forever. I've said to many dairymen, you can hardly spend enough money cooling your cows.
Yeah, we had a lecture. Dr. Israel Flammenbaum from Israel talked about the importance of keeping those animals cool. He even indicated that he thinks he can do away totally with heat stress with proper cooling and fans. So found that quite interesting. If you haven't listened to that one, would encourage you to go back and listen to that. Real quick question, maybe for Dr. Staley. Talking about mature heifers, what's the biology behind heifers that reach maturity at first calving? What's the biology that allows them to do that? Is it just the reproductive machinery? The productive machinery is just more mature and able to produce more milk?
So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between puberty, repro, and maturity. Because you can certainly get animals pregnant way too early. Mm-hmm. So they are ready to tango reproductively, but not long-term maturity-wise. And so I just want to bring up this next point because it begs the question, so what is mature? And very few dairies know what their mature body weight is. And I'll say that again, very few dairies know what their mature body weight is. And if we think that this is the denominator for a lot of things, including the nutrition program on a dairy, it really begs the question, why don't we? For example, when we bought a scale 5 years ago to validate all this, I bought a scale and had it delivered here and weighed a lot of animals. And it was amazing the difference between what dairymen thought their animals weighed and what they actually weighed. And so you can have an animal, a dairy that the mature body weight is 1,700 pounds, and the dairyman's under the illusion that it's 1,580 or 16. Well, that's a huge difference in what your goal is for those heifers, right? So to keep everything honest, I think what you really got to do is take the time to weigh those third and fourth lactation animals somewhere in mid-lactation to establish, okay, what is the genetic makeup? What's the genetic body condition score composite for this group of animals that I've bred all these years? Because then I know what I'm aiming for. Otherwise, we're shooting in the dark, I believe.
Yeah, as you were saying that, everybody will say, well, I don't have scales on my operation, right? But I go back to what Al was saying a little bit ago about hip height or wither height. That is a relatively easy measurement. You basically need a fence or a stick or whatever. Why would they not necessarily be better off looking at wither height or hip height when they get into that target breeding age, if you will? So you can either breed on age, that's easy, that's universal, right? But weight can be misleading, right? But the hip height, if you can figure out what your mature hip height ought to be, wouldn't that be a better target or a better tool as opposed to just doing it on weight?
So let me comment on that, because I was faced with that conundrum. So you're looking for relatively a small increment in height at that time frame, and Dr. Kertz will be able to tell us, but you're looking at about an inch a month, if you're lucky. I think it's somewhere around about there, versus about 60 pounds. So in a pen of 300 heifers, and you know what those feed lanes look like with manure, all sorts of, up and down, it's actually quite hard, I think, to easily get in there and do a a height. So what typically happens is tape. They put tape on the headlocks. When an animal reaches that tape, it's ready to breed. It's not very easy to pick up 1 inch of hairy coated animal in a pen at 6 in the morning. I've been very facetious and said, I'll tell you what 42 inches looks like. She's in heat and she's in the breeding pen.
You've hit on a couple of good points I'd like to elaborate a little bit about. The height is difficult to measure. It's you got to have them in headlocks or some way of doing that. And then in their second year, when they're in that breeding group and have been bred, they're only going to increase 6 inches in height.
Mhm.
So it's very difficult to pick up height differences at that point. You're better off looking at it at the end of 6 months when they should have picked up 12 inches from birth. And then maybe at 12 months, because then you've got the biggest increase in height. Just in general, it's difficult for dairies in calf and heifer operations to weigh or measure height. There's an Israeli group that's developed a 3D camera system, and I've written about it in Feedstuffs and Horde's Dairyman. Unfortunately, nobody's commercialized it. I think that would be really a good system and could readily be incorporated on operations where maybe you could have heifers at certain age and calves at least past 2 months. You could take them by that or through a area where that's measured and then it's calculated. And then back to the mature height or the mature weight and height, what we found was that, you've got to be in your 3rd or 4th lactation. And by that time, there aren't that many cows left in the herd because of culling. So it's difficult to establish what the mature weight is or height without, of course, you can spot check some and you can get an idea about that. Now when a cow or a heifer calves, they lose 11% of their body weight right then. And then heifers will make another 11% growth in their first lactation, and then about 2 more inches of height till they become mature. But if you don't have any measurements of that, you don't really know what the situation is. And I'm like Gavin, when people say, well, what do you think the weight is here? I'm not willing usually to guess because I know it's going to be a kind of a potluck thing to figure out the weight and the age.
It just seems like it's such a critical issue getting them bred at the right size and age.
At one point I wished I'd had some kind of commission from this particular scale group, because there was one scale that crossed the Sierra Nevadas, and that was the one I bought. Well, within 2 or 3 years, there were a lot of scales that came out here, because it's really not that expensive. It was like $3,500. You don't need bells and whistles, and you just set it up in the alleyway, and they're fantastic. As soon as you've got 4 pressure points, it gives you the weights. And what some dairymen are doing is they're weighing their animals around about 12 months. And then they're using that as a differential, a kind of a sort gate, if you like, in that, okay, so the animals that are on target will be eligible, and those that aren't, based on 2 pounds a day, will become eligible at such and such a time. And that way they're trying to bring together a confluence of maturity, if you like, by actually using a weight. And I will just say, to that point earlier, one cannot make butter balls. The caveat is do not overcondition these animals. Weight on its own is deadly, because we can make fat heifers very quickly.
There's a large calf and heifer ranch in Spain that I've worked with, and they raise about 6,000 a year, and from 130 different dairies. So they really have good records and keep a lot of data that most operations don't. In fact, there's a good publication in the ARPAS journal recently by Alex Bach and the manager Jose Ajito and myself about that, because it's one of the few places that they have good data. And one of the problems that you have to be concerned about on any operation is grouping. So if you group too many just weaned calves, they, of course, all have established a social order, and the lower end of that social order won't do as well.
If you want to kind of change directions here, is what impact does having the heifers mature at first calving, what impact does that have on longevity? Going back to a comment that Al made earlier about the distribution of lactations within the herd. So can we improve it by making sure those heifers are mature when they first calve?
Could I first crack at that?
Sure, absolutely.
So this is very close and near and dear to my heart. In fact, I'm working on a presentation as we speak on this exact thing, productive life, and setting these heifers up at the beginning adequately. I call them platinum heifers, call them whatever you like, but a philosophy of the best possible genetic expression of these animals, as Al was saying, in the run pens and all the rest. But if we bring in just the right number of these high value heifers that transition well, that produce well, we will be able to cut our culling down, our involuntary culls. I'm convinced of that. And ultimately, if I likened it to a tree, and if I could draw it, I'd draw it for you. But every dairy basically should be like a good old California redwood. And it should be pretty narrow at the base, roughly about 30% L1s, and then progressively get narrower. But if we have too many heifers that are poor doers at the bottom of the tree, our tree doesn't look like a redwood. It looks like some kind of like a Chinese hat, right? Broad on the base, sharp, and you'll never get longevity that way. It's straight maths. You actually have to have the top of the tree about 15%, 5 and 6s. To get a 2.6 or 2.7. So these heifers are critical, because if they have high attrition, our tree looks like it got struck by lightning.
Sure.
And I think part of the problem there can be that if you have too many heifers, for whatever reasons, you've been using sex semen or whatever it is, and you try to push them through your facility, they're too crowded, and you're doing an injustice to all of them, rather than going back, as Gavin says, and selecting the heifers. And now there's genomics that you can do some of that with, and not having more heifers than you need, because what often happens if you have more heifers than you need, you push the cows out of the herd, because you're bringing the heifers along. They got to go someplace.
Absolutely, Al. And I love genetics, but I use this analogy, if you will allow me, Scott. Having good genetics, I say, is a lot like sending a kid to Stanford College. A top school, and the tuition's right up there, and it's wonderful. The only problem is that kid never graduates. That is what it's like having great genetics, but these animals never get to express it. It's the Stanford kid syndrome.
You pay for a high quality heifer, and then you don't treat her right.
No,
you don't get her. Yeah,
you never get her right. Sometimes.
Yeah, we never get her.
The most expensive animal in the herd is that high quality, genetic heifer that milks one day and then she's down the road, right?
Yeah.
Well, and another issue is when the herds weren't as large and they knew their genetics more, and they had a DHI type record, you had actual and mature equivalent data and more information to evaluate the heifers. But when you've got to more larger commercial herds, you don't have the genetic information, and you don't have those kinds of information that you can calculate what the genetics should be and what it is, and what is it in the first lactation versus the second lactation, or in the third or fourth or fifth lactation. So without that information, it's harder to see what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an overriding young in, old out. Just the one lameness, one mastitis, one whatever, look at you skew, and the heifer shows up, knocks on the door, and an old cow goes. And when I say old cow, I'm not even saying she's a broken cow. I'm just saying she's a mature cow. There's this sort of promise of the future is young and the future is wonderful, but the future never shows up.
A related topic that you brought up, Gavin, during the webinar was that heifers that freshen when they're a little less mature often have issues with metritis. Can you talk a little bit about that and what might be causing that?
Yeah, certainly. So I think Al alluded to that earlier. I've spent many years of my career as a large animal practitioner, so I have pulled out a lot of calves on 2 different continents. And the worst nightmare still is, you're called out and there's this little heifer, this teenage pregnancy, right? And of course, I'm using the extreme, but these animals that don't have the birth canal or have those big globules of fat it splits like a ripe, papaya, those animals never end well. If you fill them up with antibiotics, they lose body condition score, they don't breed back. And there's frankly just a higher incidence of metritis, higher incidence of DOAs. I mean, right there's the giveaway. Right there's the giveaway. There's a higher correlation of DOAs and metritis, and never mind RPs. If you start off with a bad repro tract, good luck. And versus an animal that's up there at 1,400 pounds and spits out a 90-pound calf, man, it's a pretty picture.
I'm involved in a project where we're trying to look through some large-scale records that have calving difficulty scores, because I'm convinced that's one of the most unsung, ununderstood problems on a dairy. So if a calf is difficulty being born, it's more likely to die. And, born dead often includes the first 24 hours. If it doesn't die, it's compromised, and the cow's compromised. And so they never recover, at least the cow doesn't in that lactation. And so I think that we haven't done a good enough job of scoring and then looking as to why the score isn't very good for calving difficulty. Is it because the heifer's fat or the cow's fat? And if we knew that, we could get a better picture of why this calving difficulty occurs. It's all nationally somewhere around maybe 10%. It's higher for first calf heifers, lower for older cows, but there's seasonal variation. And we really haven't done a good job of looking through this and trying to sort out what are these issues that we don't recognize.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying. And I've seen those calves, and I dealt with the foals too, in the equine stud work. And I'll tell you what, they were dumb. I call them dumb animals. They were compromised at birth, and they were not functioning well. I don't know if there's a sort of a cerebral palsy equivalent for animals, but they were slower. They didn't nurse. They didn't suckle. I mean, it's not going to end well.
Yeah.
Just one other point too, as we look at longevity and productive life, non-completion rate becomes really, really important. By non-completion rate, the number of animals that are born alive that actually make it to calving, right? So this all fits in. We have to do a super job at keeping that NCR down, or we're going to have too much excess animal number in the system, leading to, obviously, as mentioned earlier, the expense of losing animals that you put so much money in.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, your arguments are very compelling. The data is very compelling. We need to have these heifers mature when they calve. What's the solution? What are the steps that get us to the solution?
I'll have first crack if you don't mind, Al.
No.
Raising heifers, if you think about it, is like a production system. And it's one of the few systems I can think of that has no quality control. Can you imagine investing $2,000 in a system where you have very little quality control? They go in one side and they spat out the other side. The solution is actually to monitor this thing, to be very, very intentional, weights, heights, whatever it takes to get this product to where it needs to be. Because the outcomes, if you don't, are long-term. In fact, I'd say almost forever. So it's well worth the effort, but we're flying blind, in my opinion. So.
I would agree. And so the more data and understanding about the growth process, how critical it is to have a good calving, a clean environment, good colostrum administration, and have a good weaning transition so we don't create problems then, double that birth weight by the end of 2 months, and then get on a good average daily gain of somewhere between 1.8 to 2 pounds. It fluctuates some because the growth hormone is episodic in its release rate, and then measures. If we don't have the measurements, I'd have to agree with Gavin. I mean, why would you do something for 2 years and then at the end not really know for sure what you have until you go into the first lactation, and maybe that's all they get because they haven't been well developed.
Yeah, right. And that's true on so many dairies. It honestly is reality.
But we have to have a better, simpler way of getting the height and the weight. And that's why I'm intrigued by this 3D system, camera system.
Me too.
No, that makes a lot of sense. When during Gavin's presentation, he made the comment that you just got to have eyes on these animals, and it immediately popped into my mind. Cameras, right? We're starting to do so much with cameras, maybe too much, and want to get political, but right. So yeah, I think technology is going to play a big role in this someday. So.
It's like a lot of things. If you don't find a simple way to do it, it simply won't happen.
Yeah, simple and cost effective. Yes.
And I think it also has to be segmented, Al. I think that whole thing of understanding where that calf weans at, where she's at, a month later, and then what, age and weight and height at breeding, those set the scale, right? Because if you do that right, and then the rest of it, just feed her halfway decent. As long as you don't overfeed her too much energy and get her into a butterball,
right?
You've got a good plane. You can get there from there. But boy, if you don't get her to breeding age,
that's why I think that 2 month period at weaning is key, and then so is the 6 month, because by the 6th month, you should have half the height increase. And if you don't have it, and you got fat, sharp animals, you got a problem.
Yeah, for life.
And the problem is going to be, having each farm having some good idea of about where that is.
Right.
As you said earlier, mature size and weight, it's going to vary from dairy to dairy based on genetics.
See, and here's another thing. There's always a pushback of spending that extra money on the protein, quality protein, to get that frame. Well, if we didn't need so many animals, we could easily spend that money on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gets back to your non-completion rate and your culling rate and longevity and all those things. Because if you don't have to have as many heifers, you can spend more money on those high-quality genetic heifers to get them into the herd, get them milking, and keep them there for a couple, 3 or 4 years if you can.
Exactly. It's that simple. It's like the cohesive equation of dairy.
Always sounds simple, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Then reality rears its ugly head.
Yeah, great comments, guys. I don't know if you just noticed, but the lights did flicker, which means that is time for last call.
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by Niasure Precision Release Niacin. Niacin is a proven vasodilator for heat stress reduction and a powerful antilipolytic agent for lowering high blood NEFA in transition cows. Protected with Balchem's proprietary encapsulation technology, you can be sure it is being delivered where and when your cows need it. Learn more at balchem.com/Niasure.
In wrapping up, would like to ask you guys just to talk to our audience about 2 or 3 things, impactful ideas for consultants, nutritionists, dairy farmers that they can do immediately to optimize their heifer production. And why don't we start with Glenn?
Well, I'll start by saying that, Gavin, I was enthralled when I saw your presentation. And actually, I think I'm sort of kind of responsible for getting you in on our Real Science lecture series, because I thought it was an amazing presentation with a whole bunch of really neat information. And Al, your contributions to calves over the years are just incredible. I was just looking at some stuff today, and I've got an article by you that was 100 years of calves, a review, I think was something along those lines, that you had in Dairy Science. So I thank you for everything you've done for the industry. I go back to what I started to say earlier. I think we just need to have, a simpler way to identify these calves as being keepers or tossers before they get into the lactation. And I think that's probably somewhere around, Al, I think that weaning period, that little transition you talked about, do they make that transition well? And then getting them, make sure they're physiologically mature enough, at least from height and weight, body condition score, or whatever. So if we can find a simpler way to do that, I think life will get a lot better for everybody.
Al, what comments do you have?
Well, I would kind of elaborate a little bit on that. I think it's important on any dairy operation that if you don't do it regularly, consistently, do it periodically. Let's get a dozen calf birth weights. And what's the range? Let's get a dozen calves weaning weights and heights. And what's the range? Let's get a dozen of them at 6 months. What's the height and the weight? And any operation can do that if they want to. It's a little extra work, but it's not like doing the whole thing. And then once you look at those numbers and you do them maybe a couple times a year, you'll have a much better idea where you are with your dairy operation and what might need to be fixed.
Yeah, great comments. Gavin will give you the final comments.
So I'll just follow on with what Al said too. I don't think you have to weigh every animal, all the heifers. I think you need to know how your system's operating. So you need these little cohorts that you can just say, are we on track or aren't we? And to the simplicity message, if you have a fairly stable system and you know that you are hitting your goals of ADG and heights and weights, then you can go at an age at breeding. If you know what the system is spitting out, you do not have to overcomplicate it like, oh, I have to weigh all these animals at breeding. You've done your homework, you've done the weights, now keep it simple. 420 days, this is what it is till further notice on this dairy. There's ways of making it very palatable, but you've got to have weights. And I'd love if these Israelis can fix this 3D thing. It'll be the solution, I'm sure. But right now, the scale works pretty well in my experience, and I'd recommend every dairy has a scale.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Gentlemen, big thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Really appreciate spending some time with you today. It's been very interesting, great information for dairy farmers. The title says it all, right? Maturity matters. It sets the ceiling for the entire herd. I think that there's nothing more that can be said that can be more convincing. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank our loyal listeners for stopping by here once again here at the Real Science Exchange. Hope to see you next time here where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
Thank you to you all.
Okay.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests. So please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.